project if you can't hear me. Please do say so, and I think we should get started because I have a lot of information to share with you, and we're already running 5 minutes behind the scheduled time. So, I'm sure you're all familiar with that Mark Andreessen quote, "In short, software is eating the world," which is a quote and the title of an article he wrote in the Wall Street Journal, well, close to a decade ago at this point, where he basically describes what people now tend to call digital transformation, but basically every vertical being either leveraging software, where you have incumbents either leveraging software to sustain their positions, or you have startups sort of like disrupting the market through software. So this was mentioned in the keynote before. So those numbers are Black Duck numbers. So Black Duck is a company that does that scans repositories for open source software and to discover security issues in the open source components. And they run about 10 to 1,200 such scans on companies every year, essentially doing mergers and acquisitions, but also as part of continuous integration. And what they found over the last year, so these are the 2017 results, is that 96% of applications that they check contain open source components, and out of those, 57% of the code base is actually open source. Right? So you have today across the industry basically every app contains open source, and on average it's more than half of the overall lines of code that are open source. Right? So it's huge. Interestingly, in fintech, the numbers are a bit smaller. It's less. So it's also around the same overall percentage that has open source, but the overall size of open source in each repository is smaller. I think it's around 30%. So I think it's good to say, it's correct to say today that not only is software eating the world, but open source is eating software, right? So basically open source is eating the world. And yet, whereas everyone is using open source, people contributing to open source and companies contributing to open source are much more rare, right? And that begs the question as to, well, why should a company contribute to open source? What's the reason for that? And in general, when that question is asked, the kind of answers that come up are sort of wishy-washy, feel-good answers, such as it's for the common good, or it's paying it forward, or my personal favorite, which is it's the right thing to do. Right? So when you actually put those reasons to contribute on a scale, right, they don't hold very long once other parts of a company start bringing up reasons not to contribute to open source. Right? So a biggie, obviously, is, well, you're losing IP. You're making IP public. Right? It's sort of like losing it as something that you can leverage. Another one that comes up is, well, you risk losing your competitive advantage. There's increased risk, right? By working in the open, you might leak things that you don't want to leak, right? Maybe security tokens, or credentials, or data, or copyrighted material, or secrets. Well, it's also costly to actually just contribute to open source, right? That there's extra work required. And so maybe those resources should be better used elsewhere. And then one that comes up quite often is, well, we don't know how to do that. We don't have the culture, right? It's not in our DNA. So whereas we understand today really well the return on investment of using open source, Well, we don't have a good understanding of the return on investment of contributing to open source. So today what I want to do is look at what are the benefits of open source and basically how we can make a business case for contributing to open source. And for this, we're going to look at that for software companies, for larger tech companies, and basically reasons, benefits of open source that affect pretty much everyone that is doing software, which, as we've seen earlier today, is pretty much every company. Another way of looking at this is, for some companies, open source is a business model. Tech companies tend to use it at a strategic level. And then the rest, and I think that is one of the key to open source that we don't hear talked about very often, is that there's a bunch of really nice second-order consequences that companies can actually leverage and help them make the case for contributing to open source thanks to those. All right. So we talked a bit about this in the keynote earlier. Software companies that have a business model around open source. This is what people tend to think about when they think about open source, right? It's these companies, right? So mainly companies that are, well, a lot of them are basically monetization strategies around an open source project initially. And whereas these are interesting, and it's great to see that they have a lot of value, and that it's a business that works in lots of cases, they usually don't really need anyone's help to know why contributing to open source is a good thing to do. They just do it. That's how they started, right? So it's interesting to look instead quite quickly at bigger companies, tech companies in particular, and see for those how contributing to open source can become a strategic advantage. So one of the key reasons large companies contribute to open source, it's a strategy to commoditize their compliments. So what does that mean? Basically, it's the sort of the opposite of vertical integration. It's the idea that if the core of your business is focused on a domain that depends on something else, make sure to commoditize that something else. And when you think about what commoditization means for software, right? Open source is sort of the ultimate way to commoditize software. And so let's look at a couple of examples of that. Consider Google, for example, right? The main focus of Google, obviously, is search. And the complement to search, well, is how do you get people to search? Initially, it was a web browser, right? Today, it's also mobile. And unsurprisingly, Google has invested a lot to contribute in Android and Chrome. So an open source browser and an open source operating system. Similarly, Intel, well, their focus is manufacturing chips, CPUs, right? So unsurprisingly, again, while Intel is the biggest contributor to Linux. So again, they're using open source as a way to commoditize the complement to CPUs, which is an operating system. Red Hat, which is actually the second biggest contributor to Linux, has also a similar strategy, right? It's selling services and packaging around Linux, and so it's really critical for it that Linux is an open source project. I mean, you wouldn't imagine Red Hat built on top of Windows, for example, right? Providing service for Windows. Red Hat would be like this really tiny company. It was not at all the same kind of value. And so the last one is an interesting one. Facebook, when you think about Facebook, one way of looking at Facebook's core business, it's in data and data mining, right? to, well, basically provide like a good user experience for their users, and then also to be able to help advertisers target these users really effectively. And so, unsurprisingly, when you think about data, you think about the complement to data, and the costly complement to data, it's data centers, right? And so Facebook launched, well, a number of years ago now, a open compute project, which is basically how to commoditize and open source designs around servers and data centers. So this is one of the really interesting strategy technique that I used to show the value of contributing to open source to essentially companies that are really in tech. Another common strategy which you see a lot of right now is a way to on-ramp developers. It's, again, not news to anyone that developers getting developers to like you as a company has been critical to any platform company for a long time. I'm sure you all remember the developers from Steve Ballmer, which is also sort of dated at this point. But it's a really important strategy. If you think about cloud computing today, and the big actor of clouds, they're all investing heavily in open source. And why is this? It's because developers that learn how to use software when they're working on a side project or a prototype of something will tend to want to use the same software when that project needs to scale or when they're using something for their company. In both cases, although they're not the actual buyers of the software when it moves at a cloud scale or at enterprise sales, they are going to be heavily influencing what the actual buyers is going to purchase. So on-ramping developers onto a platform is a very common strategy, and it's the one that's the reason why Microsoft just bought GitHub not long ago, and why IBM just bought Red Hat, or at least one of the key reasons. It's basically to help in Microsoft's case, to help onboard developers onto the Azure platform. So we've briefly looked at the reasons why companies whose business model is around open source contribute. And then we looked at a couple, two key strategic reasons why tech companies tend to contribute to open source. Now I want to look at something that is broader than all of these two, which I've called sort of like works for all companies, and which another way of looking at it is second order, basically leveraging second order consequences of contributing to open source. If there's one thing, in my opinion, that you should remember from this talk, it's the following slides and that conversation. I'm sure you're all familiar with that diagram. So it's basically a process diagram that says, well, you have an engineer in the middle that has as input problems and coffee, and as output solutions to those problems, right? And that has a byproduct, which is sarcasm. So, of course, it's funny, but the notion of a byproduct here is key, and we'll come back to it later. So keep that in mind. If we sort of make that a bit less generic and move it to software engineering, nothing much changes, right? Instead of having an engineer, you have a software engineer, and the solution is usually in the form of code. What happens, though, when you're thinking about that in the realm of open source? So what happens basically is instead of producing just code that is proprietary and kept somewhere, you're producing open source code, which ends up in a pool of commons, right? But the bigger distinction is not here. The bigger distinction is you're no longer alone as a developer or as a company working on that particular software, right? And out of that, out of the fact that you're now in this new environment, which is a multi-stakeholder environment with people from other companies, from different cultures, there's a lot of things that are going to happen between developers working on a project. Right? Just conversations on IRC or a Slack or mailing lists or GitHub issues. Of course, you're going to start to get code reviews. And bit by bit, you're going to see things emerging like mentoring, like networking, for example. People are going to start maybe coming to conferences and meeting in person. And all of that, if you remember the sarcasm byproduct that I mentioned about, is going to create byproducts, right? So these are the byproducts of the interaction of the process around making open source code, the contribution process, right? And there are lots and lots of them. This, in my opinion, is really the missed out opportunity of not contributing to open source today. And before we look at two in details, I just want to sort of like go through that list quickly with you. And so basically, what you'll see, first of all, is improvement sort of in overall code quality, right? Because multiple people contribute on a project, you'll need improved documentation. It's going to enable also lowering technical depth. If you contribute back to a project, you can avoid maintaining a fork locally, right? As a company, you'll also be able to influence the project direction if it's not your project in a much stronger way than if you're just sitting on the sidelines. At the engineering level, what that's going to change is it's really going to put your teams, your engineers, in an environment where they learn a lot, right? And so they're going to level up technically, but they're also going to level up in terms of soft skills, right? Communication. Everything is done in written, or maybe through presentations and conferences. It's also a great way to keep up to date with best practices, right? And the other aspect of it is obviously that it's going to give you access to a network of experts in that field through all of the connections and networking that you've done in that open source project. For the company itself, what it does is it changes the perception of the company and makes it look like an industry leader, right? Which de facto it becomes as it's influencing key projects of the industry. So it's really good for the company's public perception, and especially its perception among developers. It also provides the company with a talent pool. All of these developers working on that project, you have strong connections with. It's a lot easier to hire from those developers than it is from developers in the wild. And you actually note that they know how to do the work because you've been working with them already. It builds a remote-friendly culture because open source is distributed, which is great because that allows you to access talent outside of actually where you're based. It tends to reduce churn. It tends to improve the culture and moral inside of a company. A company that is doing open source really well is going to be much better perceived than one that isn't. And then lastly, that has really strong impacts on the company's ability to innovate, ability to be effective. We'll look at that in a second. And also, there's a concept I'd love to talk about, I don't think we'll have the time, which is the idea of knowledge spillover, which is basically what happens in what Silicon Valley is historically known for. When people from very different companies and competing companies tend to interact on a regular basis, information leaks in ways that are not damaging to the companies, but that basically help innovation. Prevents people from making the same mistakes across different companies. So we actually now are starting to have data as to how those byproducts improve, basically are beneficial to companies contributing to open source. So this is a study that came out not long ago, actually, by Frank Nagel. And what he did is he looked at the Linux contributors to Linux, companies that were contributing to Linux, and companies that were using Linux but not contributing to it, so free riders. And what he was able to prove is that there's actually companies that contribute are twice as efficient as companies that don't. So it's not like 5 or 10% more, right? It's 100% more efficient, which when you think about it is logical. They know the innards of the software that they're relying on better than anyone else, right? And as one knows, abstraction tends to leak. So knowing what's under what you're using is actually generally very useful. And the second aspect is obviously they have a huge network of people to tap into if they bump into issues. Another way that those byproducts are really useful is for hiring purposes, right? So Facebook, now a number of years ago, launched a really big initiative internally to become much more open to open source and open to contributing open source. And that's what led, at a later stage, to releasing React and the success that React has had, right? And what they did is they ran some numbers once they started this open source program for new hires. And it turns out that even for a company like Facebook that at that time was just after IPO or just had IPO, that was a really hot tech company, it turns out that having an open source program that was well known and well respected in the industry was key for a number of hires. 75% of them actually said that Facebook's open source program had been a key aspect of them accepting the offer. So imagine what that can do for a company that doesn't have sort of the cachet of Facebook, right? And before we move on, I just want to present you with this small case study, which I think is interesting. Trivago, which you might know as a company that basically compares prices of hotels and lets you buy the cheapest room in a given destination, decided 2 years ago to sponsor through Open Collective the Webpack project. And the reason they did that is that they were relying on Webpack a lot at work, and they did not have the resources to actually contribute to it in terms of engineering resources, but they had the money to do so. So they put the money where their mouth was and gave Webpack $100,000 to pay for Webpack developers to improve it. And after a year, they discussed it. They were interviewed by the Webpack maintainers to sort of discuss it. And out of that discussion came those two quotes, which, A, they were super happy about the work that had been done, right? So the money was a super good investment. But there was, again, this interesting byproduct, a side effect of their investment, which was that because of their involvement as a sponsor of that project, they became known in the front-end JavaScript land in Europe as a hot place to go work to, because it was an open source and modern company to join. And so they started having lots of people that were really keen on joining the company and hired a bunch of those. So that's another really compelling example of how byproducts can actually be a really sound, really help make the case for contributing to open source. So we now have a whole set of arguments to help make our case, right? Tip the balance in favor of open source. And the question is whether we can actually also help sort of trim the weight of the arguments against. So we won't have the time to look at all of them, but I want to look at two which, in my opinion, are critical. One is lost competitive advantage. This is something that in practice is often not true. Of course, no one is suggesting that you should open source like the key, the key software that really makes a difference. But most of the time, your competition, right, companies that can compete against you, are not going to be companies that are sitting on the sidelines waiting for you to open source stuff and copy it, right? That is not how competition works. This is an overused quote, I agree, but it's a really good one, right? You don't want to skate where the puck was, you want to skate where the puck is going to be. And your competitors, the ones that you should be worried about, are not the ones that are going to be waiting for you to open source stuff to then rely on it. And again, there's an old example of that is interesting, which is from Oleg Kalugin, an ex-KGB spy, that said, well, the KGB was able to get all of these files from like IBM and from all of the corporate spying it was doing back during the Cold War. But the problem was, by the time they actually figured out what to do with it and how to implement this stuff that they had stolen, 5, 6, 7 years had gone by, and the West was onto something completely different, right? So it's not like it's nothing to be scared about. Of course, you have to balance things, but the big scare of we're going to lose competitiveness is usually not a sound one. Then the second one I want to look at is the lost IP. And I want to read to you this quote from Yann LeCun because I think it's an important one. Yann LeCun is Facebook's head of artificial intelligence, and he recently wrote an article in Business Insider describing how he had maintained a position and a role at New York University as a chair of AI there, plus led Facebook's AI organization at the same time from an intellectual property perspective. And so what he says boils down to this is, in today's world of fast-paced internet services deployment, owning IP, owning intellectual property, has become considerably less important than turning research results into innovative products as quickly as possible and deploying them at scale. So the value of IP itself is no longer really critical. What matters is how you can turn research results, like what you find out, into products. And how best can you do that, if you think about it, is with teams that are super efficient and composed of top talent, right? So all of those really interesting byproducts of open source that we were talking about before suddenly become the area where the real value is. And there's more research today that shows that actually it is really how efficient and how good your teams are at leveraging changing conditions, leveraging software to deal with changing business conditions that are going to make a difference, much more than hoarding a bunch of patents or a bunch of copyright in your sort of your asset folder. So, yes, sorry, now that we've shrunk all of these, well, some of these, I didn't have time to go over all of them, but some of these arguments against contributing to open source, what I want to quickly make you consider before moving on to Q&A is that all of these arguments, not all of these arguments are going to be valid for your case. Depending on your company, some of those arguments are going to matter more. And maybe, IP can be more critical if you're in an environment where there's a lot of patent suits happening, for example. So what you really need to do is take all of these, weights, these Lego bricks, and build a case that works for your company. And when you do that, what you want to do is you want to focus on business outcomes. You want to be reasonable, right? That is, if your company just bought a huge patent portfolio, if you try to open source all the things, well, probably you're going to have a hard time. And what you want to do is show empathy to the needs of other people in the organization. That's critical. Developers tend to not really consider what lawyers are there for. And similarly, lawyers tend to forget that developers also are there to innovate and move quickly. And so showing empathy and understanding to how these two organizations and company function is going to really get you a lot further than not doing so. And also maybe start small, right? Aim for small wins. Maybe try to find a way to open source a single project. Or start, I don't know, allowing people to contribute to something that you really care about that is not where most of your intellectual property is. And remember, I think one of the keys to remember that this is really a mindset shift. There's this idea that open source is sort of like this nice thing to do, contribute to open source. It's like nice, it's sort of like hippie-ish, you know, people look for the common good. Well, it's a complete mindset shift to really see it as one of the key reasons why tech companies are making such a dent in the world today and are just increasing their power on a regular basis. So just for the kicks, I created sort of like one of those for what a patent troll would do, right? So for a patent troll, obviously, the only thing that matters is the IP, and so it would be ridiculous for them to start contributing to open source. All right, I'm done. Do you have questions?
Sir?
Yes, please. Oh, and sorry, in the back.
John Levan from the Open Compute Foundation. Have you got any comments about Microsoft open sourced its patent portfolio 2 weeks ago, about 60,000 patents? Any kind of comments on that?
So the question for the microphone is whether I have any comments about Microsoft opening about 60,000 of its patents to the, I don't know the mechanism, to the Linux Foundation or something like this. I'm not too sure what the details are. Well, I mean, in my opinion, it's tied to pretty much what I've discussed here, which is they see a lot of value. Microsoft is betting on the cloud, right? And to get people, to on-ramp people to the cloud, as I mentioned before, it's strategic for them. That's why they bought GitHub. It's strategic for them to convince developers that they are a good open source citizen. And so suddenly the value of those patents are much, well, they're much lighter. The value is much less than it used to be when Microsoft's business strategy was different. And today, it is probably seen as a very good sign from a developer perspective, and there's probably other business reasons to open up these patents. And to make it possible for Microsoft to be perceived as a really good actor in that space. In my opinion, that's the key reason. Yes, please.
So I think you've alluded to this, but it seems to me that whatever you develop internally, unless you open source it, someone else will overtake you, and it becomes technical debt.
Yeah, so that's more of a comment than a question. Can I try to repeat that comment for the recording purposes? So basically, yes. If that's a question, then the answer is yes. If you don't open source something that is not key to your strategy, someone else is going to come and do it better than you, and going to open source it, right? Yeah, that's how it works. So yes, absolutely. Yes, please.
I've got some comments as well. So my background, I was co-founder of Alfresco activity, now Flowable, so I've lived in open source software for some time now. I think a couple of points. One is loss of IP is always the one that I've ever encountered that is the biggest barrier. In small companies, it's a CEO who is emotionally attached to their differentiation or whatever that is the barrier. You need to educate them. The real problem with bigger companies is the legal department.
Yes.
You need the legal department at these events to actually understand what it is. So that's one thing is you're preaching to converted here. We're all preaching to converted. It's getting the legal people here. The other comment on the sort of benefit is the biggest benefit. I mean, not what you talked about is strategic benefit. I absolutely agree with all of that. There's tactical benefit in that it's an emotional thing. If you're working with developers, if you're contributing there's a personal relationship, there's a trust, there's a willingness to give more to those people that contribute. So
Yes.
I know my guys do more for the people that contribute than anyone else. So if you hit a problem, you're going to get a faster response if you've been contributing than if you've been a bystander. And I think that tactical, I've got a problem, as you say, it's the speed of iteration of getting new innovation out. You just want to smooth out any blocks to that innovation and tying in with the developers by contributing. That emotional tie is really, really important.
Absolutely. I think that falls perfectly into those sort of byproduct category that I mentioned, in the sense that, when you build a network, which is what happens when you contribute to open source, then you can tap into the network when you need to. Yes?
So, talking about this lost IP,
Yes.
I've seen two sides of it trying to make a case.
I wanted to come back to that because I didn't address this.
So one of them is we may be giving away the crown jewels argument.
Yes.
But the other one is, if you take this stuff that we developed internally and release it, then the amount of code review we're going to have to do to make sure that there's nothing in there that's patent encumbered or otherwise leaves us open to liability is huge. So it is often difficult to get past that challenge around, is this exposing us to litigation risk or patent trolls? Have you had any discussions with people around how to address that argument?
So the question is around IP and sort of the extra amount of work that needs to happen to open source existing software. That is a real problem. My answer to that is maybe don't start with open sourcing something that is that big. And it's probably a lot easier to actually start building in the open from the get-go. Right? I would recommend that as a strategy. So maybe, don't start with this huge project that has a whole bunch of issues, and instead focus on small ones. And I wanted to come back on this legal argument. I think, yes, absolutely, having legal in the room is critical. So I gave a talk about this really recently at the Linux Open Source Summit in Edinburgh. I think that people are really scared about legal, especially people that are not lawyers. And from my experience dealing with lawyers for a number of years, they're actually much nicer than you think they are. No, really. They tend to have a really different way of thinking about problems than people that come more from the engineering side do. But when you actually start, when you show empathy and when you attune to those differences, it's actually surprisingly easier to get stuff done, especially if you start showing them what they can get out of it. And there usually is plenty that a legal team has to handle that if you have, for example, a really good open source contributing policy, they will no longer have to care about, and it will be just done and automated for them. And that will free their time, for example, to focus on things that are much more important to the company. So that's one example. It's sort of outside of the scope of the question. And the other one is, if you really start tying things to business goals and business outcomes, then it's much easier to make those decisions. Right? If you can really strongly make the business case for why it's important to open source something, then actually doing the work to make sure that you're not leaking stuff that you're not supposed to leak or creating liabilities, it's an easier sell, right? So to answer your question, I would say start small, and then make sure that the business value is really well understood by everyone. I think, no, sorry, after. Thank you so much for your time.